The Sydney Harbour Bridge by Rolls-Royce. Rupert Murdoch on his way to his office. If the News of the World deal goes through, he'll transfer his base to London. Murdoch inherited the basis of his newspaper empire from his father, built on it and enlarged it to cover every state in Australia. He's chubby-cheeked and open-faced, but underneath, say those who know him, he's a man of steel. Ruthless in getting his own way, iron-willed in seeing that his plans are carried through. If he succeeds in gathering the News of the World reins into his hands, it's likely they'll be in for some pretty aggressive management. Murdoch's Australian empire also extends to the booming pop record business. And he has several television stations scattered around Australia as well. He's been likened to a junior Lord Thomson, and his management and consistent empire building certainly have the Thomson hallmark. But there's a difference. He takes an active part in what goes into his papers, even going into the composing room to supervise what's in the page proofs for next day's edition.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. Although, if I can just hold you there for a minute, I think that this question of the power of newspaper proprietors can be greatly overdone. We have more responsibility than power, I think. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one? I think the important thing is that there'll be plenty of newspapers with plenty of different people controlling them, so that there's a variety of viewpoint, that there's a choice for the public. This is the freedom of the press that is needed. Freedom of the press mustn't be one-sided just for a publisher to speak as he pleases, try and bully the community. There must be an alternative. And so long as there are alternatives, then I think that the public's very well protected. Certainly better protected than they'd be if the whole thing was run by a government instrumentality.
That is the question of power, of course. Who's really got it, the editor or the newspaper proprietor? Do you, for instance, interfere much with your editor's policies?
Yes, I do a bit. I get very involved in the newspapers themselves and in sometimes in public arguments that we're conducting or involved in. But on the other hand, I think that I give my editors tremendous freedom, and the only people who claim that I don't give them enough freedom now are the people who didn't know how to use it.
I suppose most newspaper owners get accused of this, but I've heard you described as ruthless. It is true that two of your most prominent editors, Rowan Rivett in Adelaide and Max Newton in Canberra, have resigned, and there has been a very large turnover of staff on the Australian. What's the story here?
Well, let's just consider the editors first. I think I said earlier I've had a lot of editors. And only two, now you mention these two, I can think of a third that I've parted company with. It's a pretty good average, really.
He's been called the whiz kid of Australian journalism. Others liken him to Beaverbrook for his hirings and firings. He's no respecter of persons or government.
We don't want to fall too much for the line put out by these Treasury economists all the time. They're very good at telling every state and everyone how they mustn't spend any money because it's not economic or something like that. Throw millions around Canberra for their own comfort without thinking twice. So that's a national duty.
Outside Sydney, he has a 3,000-acre farm, but unlike some newspaper tycoons with similar places, he doesn't hold court there. For him, it's a place to relax by rounding up the cattle.
I think I'm far too easygoing, as a rule. I'm quite capable of being hard. And probably I put up with situations for too long and then blow up the end of the situation. But I don't think I'm bad-tempered at all, except when I'm giving up smoking.
a private plane, the hallmark of today's millionaire. Some financiers think he's flying too high in taking on the News of the World, but he says the News of the World organisation is now ripe for expansion into TV or possibly a new daily.
Rupert Murdoch learned a lot about post-war Britain and its privileged elite. He'd arrived, remember, as the son of a wealthy Australian media baron and been treated like a colonial upstart. In 3 months, here at the Daily Express, he learned how to produce a newspaper capable of selling 4 million copies a day. In 1953, aged 22, he went back to Australia to claim his inheritance from his father, his own first newspaper. But although Sir Keith was the most prominent figure in Australian journalism, the only newspaper he was able to bequeath to his son was a small afternoon tabloid, the Adelaide News. This taught Rupert Murdoch a lesson he would never forget. Ownership and control were more important than public standing. And so he began building an empire. And as he did so, Rupert Murdoch developed a formula for success. First, snap up a failing newspaper, shamelessly popularise it with irreverence and sensation, and a no-holds-barred approach to eye-catching scoops. A photographer famously disguised himself as a doctor to get this picture of singer Marianne Faithfull unconscious after a drug overdose. By 1968, Rupert Murdoch was a force to be reckoned with. He owned 5 newspapers, including The Australian, that country's only national daily, and 2 TV stations.
Do you think it's possible people have underestimated you?
Yes, I think so. They had it pretty easy themselves in what they were doing. They were doing well. And they didn't see these opportunities because they weren't looking for them. And when someone else found them, they still couldn't believe that the opportunities were really there.
He'd also acquired a reputation for ruthlessness.
You don't realise that there's a great deal of iron behind the boyish exterior. He's a very tough proprietor who I think sacked more journalists than I think I'd ever seen sacked before in my whole career. He's a tremendous sacker, but of course he's also a tremendous hirer. So he's always sacking them and hiring them.
Rupert